Could removing bureaucratic red tape actually boost your family's income by thousands of dollars and, instantly drop the price of gas?
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a scalpel to, well, a stack of policy research, really looking for the facts that explain one of the biggest economic shifts happening right now. So it is October 2025, and there is genuinely surprising news at the pump. Gas prices are nearing a 4-year low across the country. The national average is even projected to dip below $3 per gallon for the first time since 2021.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that the sources we've looked at, they're directly attributing this really dramatic decline to a recent renewed commitment to unleashing domestic energy production. It's being held up as, a proof point by advocates of deregulation. They are really optimistic, suggesting that if this course continues, some areas could even see prices drop below $2 per gallon in the weeks ahead. Wow, below $2. I mean, that is a monumental drop. That instantly frees up cash for millions of families. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We are diving deep into the specific policy roadmap. It's a document outlining what they call 9 policy objectives that argues for, well, energy dominance versus regulatory restrictions. We need to uncover the massive economic stakes that this whole debate represents for really every single American household.
Right. But before we get into the specifics of how we might get cheap energy, we have to ground this discussion in economic fairness. High energy costs aren't just an inconvenience. They are a really severe financial burden, and it's disproportionately crushing those who can least afford it.
That is such a critical point. The hearing transcripts we reviewed, they emphasize that with, frankly, shocking clarity. If you look at the most vulnerable segments of the population, the burden is just overwhelming. Households making less than $10,000 annually, they pay an estimated average of 77% of their total income towards energy costs.
77%. Just think about that for a moment. That is nearly 3 out of every $4 earned just going straight toward keeping the lights on or, driving to work, heating their homes. And the pain doesn't stop there. For households with pre-tax incomes below $50,000, their energy spending jumped sharply. It went from 12% of their after-tax income back in 2001, spiking all the way up to 20% by 2013.
Yeah, it really shows that energy policy is like an instant driver of poverty or prosperity. The analysis in the source material we have is stark. Energy policies implemented since 2021 have directly cost the average U.S. household about $2,548. That's not abstract money. That's, money taken right out of the savings accounts and grocery budgets.
Exactly. And you can track exactly where that cost surge came from. The analysis points to residential electricity costs rising 23%. Home heating oil is up a staggering 69%. And gasoline increased 0.97 cents per gallon. That's a 42% surge. That data is really the foundation of the argument for energy abundance. The argument is that conventional energy policies have just been far too expensive for the American people. Okay, so let's unpack this agenda then, this idea for energy abundance. We're looking at the core ideas laid out in these 9 policy objectives. This is basically a comprehensive roadmap compiled by major policy thinkers advocating for capitalizing on America's vast oil and gas resources. The core belief seems to be that the U.S. has such massive reserves that, while regulatory reform can truly unlock national prosperity.
And when we talk about prosperity, the projected benefits are, they're truly transformative according to this model. The Heritage Energy model analyzed a scenario where recoverable shale resources increased by 50%, which is a goal, they argue, achievable simply by removing regulatory hurdles and, bureaucratic bottlenecks.
Okay, so what does a 50% increase in shale resources actually translate to in the economy? This is where the numbers become almost, hard to believe. The analysis projects this abundance agenda would generate over $25 trillion in total gross domestic product through 2050 and produce peak employment gains of 6 million jobs and, get this figure, increase aggregate GDP per family of 4 by a massive $39,000.
Yeah, that $39,000 figure, that's really the centerpiece of the argument here. It suggests that deregulation isn't just some political talking point. It's potentially a massive wealth generator, stemming from cheaper input costs across the whole economy, not just at the pump, creating this huge multiplier effect. It implies that these regulations are kind of acting like a hidden tax on productivity.
And beyond just the GDP gains, it translates directly to consumer savings, right? The same forecast suggests that maximizing domestic production would lead to an immediate $0.20 per gallon reduction in gasoline prices in the short run, and that grows to a $0.60 per gallon reduction in the long term. That's real money, especially for those families we mentioned spending 77% of their income just trying to keep the heat on.
That's right. But as we transition to how they propose to achieve this, we need to understand that all those massive economic benefits, they really hinge on removing specific policy roadblocks. The sources identify what advocates are calling the regulatory war against domestic energy.
So what specifically are the biggest targets of this proposed policy cleanup?
Well, we can break it down into maybe two main areas. First, there are the, let's say, highly visible political actions that signal discouragement to the industry. The most famous example cited is, of course, the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. That signals that future infrastructure projects might face arbitrary political roadblocks.
Right. And what about private investment? I noticed the sources also single out ESG mandates, that acronym for environmental, social, and governance. Why are those seen as a roadblock?
Well, it's framed as a matter of capital access. The sources define ESG mandates as a set of investment guidelines aimed at socially conscious goals. Advocates for deregulation argue that these guidelines actively discourage private investment. They essentially starve conventional energy projects of the necessary capital, acting like an invisible hand, sort of phasing out conventional fuel without a vote.
Okay. And the second major area is federal land access. This seems like a more straightforward bureaucratic constraint.
It absolutely is, according to the sources. The roadmap argues for immediately reinstating the legally required oil lease sales on federal lands and waters. Furthermore, they stress that Congress needs to step in and streamline the regulatory processes, specifically federal leasing and permitting, instead of leaving those complex decisions in the hands of bureaucrats who, they argue, often just delay for delay's sake.
And we can see the impact of this kind of regulatory burden at the state level, too, right? The sources point to California as a textbook example of what they call a tax and regulate regime.
It's presented as a critical case study, yeah. Because of the difficulty and cost of compliance, refinery operators are making business decisions to just close capacity. We're talking about the planned closure of Phillips 66 capacity that handles 139,000 barrels per day, and Valero's closure 145,000 barrels per day. I mean, when nearly 300,000 barrels per day of refining capacity just disappears, supply bottlenecks get worse instantly, impacting the whole Western market.
The sheer cumulative burden of regulation is stunning. One detail in the source material really highlights this. The policy objectives contrast the cost of one specific modern EPA rule, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard, or MATS, with decades of prior environmental regulation.
This is one of the most striking data points in the entire stack we looked at. The estimated annualized cost of just the MATS rule is $9.6 billion. That single rule actually eclipses the estimated $6.6 billion cost of all prior Clean Air Act regulations on the utility sector combined.
Wow, that is not just adding a rule, that's fundamentally changing the cost structure of energy production practically overnight. If one new regulation costs 50% more than all previous regulations put together, well, it kind of explains why production costs are seen as so high and why this roadmap focuses so intensely on cutting red tape.
Precisely. So if these policy roadblocks are presented as the root cause, the solution outline focuses on policy mechanisms for immediate relief, mainly by relieving those infrastructure and trade choke points.
Okay, let's define these choke points they're targeting for reform. They include things like the Renewable Fuel Standard, the Jones Act, and permitting under NEPA and the Clean Water Act. These are highly specific bits of policy that, honestly, most people probably don't think about when filling up their tanks.
Well, that's the nature of bureaucracy, right? Take the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS. This mandate requires blending ethanol into gasoline. Critics argue this distorts the market, drives up the price of corn, and ultimately limits the fuel supply mix available.
And the Jones Act. That governs maritime commerce. How does that raise the price of energy for, the average driver?
The Jones Act requires that all goods shipped between U.S. ports must be transported on ships that are built, owned, and operated by Americans. Now, while that supports domestic labor, advocates for deregulation argue it severely limits the available fleet capacity. It makes it hugely expensive and inefficient to move fuel from, say, Texas up to the Northeast, adding cost to every gallon. And finally, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is cited because its permitting schemes can take years, sometimes even decades, to approve essential things like pipelines and energy infrastructure, locking in those high costs just due to delay.
The underlying market philosophy in this policy roadmap is also critical here. It seems to be rejecting the idea that conventional and renewable energy can't coexist. Instead of government favoritism, the sources argue strongly for market competition.
Yeah, they state quite clearly that policymakers should stop granting tax favors and what they call wasteful spending to green energy companies that wouldn't survive in the marketplace on their own. The argument is basically that true competition, rather than subsidy, should determine the future energy mix.
Now look, in the interest of a complete picture, we absolutely have to acknowledge the counter perspective that's also cited in the sources regarding the global market. There is a strong argument that U.S. domestic policy can only do so much because, well, energy prices are ultimately set by global markets and cartels like OPEC.
That's an essential nuance, definitely. One source notes that even when the U.S. has produced the most oil in, say, 15 years, the price remains tied to the world price. The U.S. can't entirely decouple itself from global commodities. It's just not how it works.
But the conservative argument presented in these sources counters that domestic production still provides massive benefits, even if we can't completely control the price, right?
Absolutely. High domestic production, even if it's globally priced, dramatically increases global spare capacity. This makes the U.S. and its allies more resilient to geopolitical shocks, like the instability during the Libya crisis, for example. It means we are less vulnerable to sudden supply disruptions.
Okay. And we also need to note the alternative policy direction mentioned in some of the sources. Rather than just increasing supply through deregulation, some experts believe doubling car fuel economy standards by 2025 is actually the most effective way to cut energy costs for consumers.
Right, that policy is equated by its proponents to basically getting $1 off a gallon of gas just through reduced demand. It's a strong counter-argument focusing on efficiency rather than abundance.
It does raise an interesting question, though. If doubling fuel efficiency provides such significant and direct consumer savings, a full dollar per gallon, potentially, why is that alternative solution sort of relegated to the end of the source material when the economic relief is framed as so significant?
Yeah.
It really shows the fundamental tension between these supply-side abundance strategies and the demand-side efficiency mandates.
It absolutely reinforces the idea that this is a policy divide, maybe even a philosophical one, not just an economic calculation. It's about the core belief in how to achieve cheap energy. Is it through mandated efficiency or through unleashed production?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Our deep dive today reveals, well, a fundamental policy conflict. On one side, we have this roadmap seeking energy abundance through immediate deregulation, eliminating what they see as burdensome mandates and unlocking domestic resources for national benefit. On the other side, we see policies pushing for a rapid, often mandated transition away from conventional fuels, sometimes regardless of the immediate cost to the consumer or the complexity of the global market.
Yeah, the key takeaway seems simple and clear from these materials. Policy choices directly dictate energy costs and, consequently, your economic health. The price you pay at the pump is revealed to be, really, a political decision as much as it is just a market fluctuation.
Which raises an important question for you to consider as we wrap up. If eliminating burdensome regulations can genuinely generate $39,000 in additional GDP for the average family of four, as these sources claim, what other seemingly small, maybe complex regulatory decisions in areas like transportation, manufacturing, or even housing might be holding back massive economic opportunity right now, and well, why are we still keeping them?